is Greg Hunt from Chicago Faucets. Today, I'd like to welcome everybody for this webinar, Proactive Legionella Water Management, 0 cases, not zero Legionella. Our speaker today is Dr. Janet Stout, President and founder of the Special Pathogens Laboratory and Research Associate Professor at the University of Pittsburgh Swanson School of Engineering in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. An infectious disease microbiologist, Dr. Stout is recognized worldwide for over 30 years of pioneering research in Legionella. Her expertise includes disinfection and control strategies for the prevention of Legionnaire's disease and other waterborne pathogens. This is why we are honoring Dr. Stout as one of our first Healthy Buildings heroes, hosting a 3-part online seminar series with Dr. Stout, along with some fantastic registrant giveaways of educational tools, amazing classes, water management software from the Special Pathogens Lab. Please continue to follow the Chicago Faucet Company and the Special Pathogens Lab to learn more. Before we begin, I'd like to inform the audience to please feel free to submit the questions through the event via the question and answer feature on your toolbar. If you move your little arrow down below, you'll see a little Q&A. That's where we'll collect the questions for the end. Our speaker will leave some time at the very end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible, hopefully all of them. Any technical questions you may have will be addressed as soon as possible. Please put those in the chat. Please note that information on how to view the recording of today's Lunch and Learn will be sent in a follow-up email. So if you're registered, you'll see that later today. And now it is my pleasure to hand everything over to today's presenter. Please go ahead, Dr. Janet Stout.
Thank you so much, Greg, for that kind introduction. And I just want to give a shout out to Chicago Faucets for giving us the opportunity to be together today, and for me to talk about my favorite subject, Legionella. So we're going to talk about proactive approaches to prevention, 0 cases, not zero Legionella. So Greg talked about the 2 hats that I wear as president of Special Pathogens Laboratory, where we're what we say more than a laboratory. But I just wanted to say the reason it's important to note that I have an affiliation with the university is that that's where ongoing research and new information is learned so that I can give you sort of the newest information and keep you current. Okay, so we can't have a lecture without talking about our current pandemic situation. I always thought this was a funny cartoon, the pandemic and social distancing with even affecting Waldo here. And sort of a little public health announcement, you know, even though I wish I could get rid of my mask entirely, we're not done with COVID quite yet. So, keep up the good work on prevention of that infection as well. So as Greg mentioned, I have been studying Legionella for a long time. And this is what I say about that. When an infectious disease microbiologist studies Legionella for more than 30 years, I'm not a microbiologist anymore. I'm a Legionellologist. Okay, yeah, I did make that up, but it adequately describes my focus and the fact that, you know, Legionella is my life. And you might admire that, or you might think, that's so sad, Janet. But, you know, what I want to do today is share what I've learned and help you to address Legionella risk going forward. I don't know if you've read this book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, but it's a great book, so I highly recommend it. And he's famous for this phrase, begin with the end in mind. And what he means by that is the extent to which you begin with the end in mind determines whether or not you're successful. Well, the end that I have in mind, and here at Special Pathogens, it's part of our mission, is to end Legionnaire's disease. No one should die of this preventable disease. If you control the bacteria in the water, you prevent infection. And so Legionnaire's disease can and should be prevented. Now, I just want to give you all sort of some compassion and empathy. Your role in healthcare has grown and grown and grown in responsibilities. I can remember back in the day when I was at the Pittsburgh VA and I was in the plumbing shop and I was hanging out with the plumbers. In the 90s, there were 10 of them. And then in the 2000s, there were 3 of them. And basically, you're asked to do more and more and more with less and less and less. And so, you have increasing responsibilities. These are sort of the standard responsibilities and very important ones for that you make sure that the hospital is operating properly. But when you started your job, you probably didn't know you were going to be responsible for Legionella, interpreting culture results, potable water, secondary disinfection, case investigations, ASHRAE standard, CMS, the Joint Commission, CDC, all of that now has changed for you. And so some of you might be old enough to recognize Bob Dylan here. The times they are changing. And we have to keep up with those changing times. And that's really the purpose of this lecture today, is to help you to meet the challenges in this changing environment. So this is the list of things that I think are important for you to know and understand and that I can help with. Sort of like the alphabet soup of regulations, CDC, CMS, ASHRAE, the Joint Commission. But with respect to Legionella, what does it mean to you? And then really interesting is recent changes in CDC guidance regarding routine Legionella testing. And I'll share with you my thoughts on that. And then, of course, the whole point of this is to be proactive, not reactive when you're dealing with Legionella. It's very painful if it's reactive. And then finally, if I have Legionella, now what? And we're going to answer all those questions today. But first, I like to answer this question with regard to preventing Legionnaire's disease. How are we doing? Well, this is what I think. Progress has been slow. How slow? Really slow. Now, I'm a glass half full person, so my snails are almost at the finish line. So I think we're really going to cross that finish line and do much, much better. But I say progress has been slow because outbreaks continue to occur associated with various building water systems. So I'm just going to highlight a few. And I'm going to start with not a healthcare related one, but a hot tub outbreak at a fair, like county fair, state fair. And I'm doing this because I want to caution you about hot tubs. So be careful hanging around hot tubs. If you need to use one, don't stay in it more than 10 minutes, and maybe we can talk about that later. So be careful about hot tubs. Lots of examples of outbreaks, and most of them are, Legionella is a media darling. It's in the newspaper, it's on the TV. So Ohio Hospital, this outbreak was associated with the hot water distribution system, which is common, and also associated with construction. Don't let ice machines be a blind spot. That's what happened here in Pittsburgh at UPMC Medical Center. They were disinfecting the water distribution system, but forgot about ice machines, and up jumped the devil. There were cases. Hematology oncology unit, high-risk individuals. This was also construction renovation. And after that renovation, they had an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. Sometimes you think Legionella is like lightning. It's not going to strike me, and it certainly isn't going to strike twice. Well, tell that to the University of Washington Medical Center, where they had Legionella problems consecutive years in a row. Now, most of you probably have seen this chart that basically just says that Legionella is a problem, but it continues to increase year after year after year. And what I want to share with you is some of the reasons why. And certainly increased awareness is one of them. Doctors are ordering Legionella diagnostic tests more often. But something you might not know about is, what is the contribution of the weather? There are certain areas of the country that we know have a higher incidence of Legionnaire's disease. Well, why? So this was a 2017 report in Emerging Infectious Diseases, Weather-Dependent Risk for Legionnaire's Disease. And I highlighted the findings, and I'm going to read them to you. Warm weather, there was a dose response between humidity and the chance of getting Legionnaire's disease. When the temperature was 60 to 80 degrees with high humidity, it was 3 times more likely that someone got Legionnaire's disease. So fascinating. And then fast forward 2 more years, Solar and climate effects explain the wide variation in Legionellosis incidence in the United States. So this study went even further, and their conclusions were the incidence of Legionnaire's disease varied remarkably by region, with the highest in Ohio and New York and the lowest in Alaska. And it was environmental conditions that strongly influenced the incidence. And what were they? Warmer temperatures, greater precipitation, and less sunshine. Well, what is that? How does that relate to transmission of Legionnaire's disease? Well, if it's more humid and the air is less dry, it's going to travel further in that drift, for example, from a cooling tower. So really interesting and something you probably haven't heard before. So let's get to the crux of the matter, healthcare acquired cases, the epidemiology and infection prevention. So back in 2017, the CDC published this report about healthcare associated Legionnaire's disease. And they looked at 20 different states in a large metropolitan area. And they came away with interesting conclusions. And the headline here is that Legionnaire's disease is a problem for healthcare facilities. And the green states here are just the states where Legionnaire's disease was looked for and detected. So don't get excited if you're not one of those green states. Doesn't mean you don't have Legionnaire's disease there. So they said 20% of all the reported cases were healthcare acquired. And then they also said that the majority that fulfilled a definition of definite healthcare acquired were, of course, in long-term care. And that makes sense because they're not going lots of different places. And then finally, the big conclusion is that it's a nationwide problem. Of the 21 jurisdictions that they investigated, 20 out of 21 had cases of healthcare acquired Legionnaire's disease. So hospitals are at significant risk. Hospitals accounted for 57% of the cases, but more importantly, 85% of the deaths. We can do better. And so this prompted the then director, Ann Shushat, to say this: Legionnaire's disease in hospitals is widespread, deadly, and preventable. These data are especially important for healthcare facility leaders, doctors, you facility managers, and I'd add infection prevention, because it reminds them to think about the risks of Legionella, and this is my favorite part, and to take action. That's what we want. They also published this report looking specifically at environmental control and deficiencies, what was going on in these facilities. And what they found was, of 27 outbreaks, long-term care and hospitals accounted for 34% of the outbreaks. So again, sort of just hammering home, this is a problem, even if you might not realize it, in healthcare. And although many people say to me, Janet, Legionnaire's disease, isn't that cooling tower disease? No, it's potable water. It's the water coming out of the faucets and showers in your healthcare facilities. And in this study, potable water was the most frequent source of exposure, 56%, followed by cooling towers, only 22%. And the percentage was even higher for healthcare. 67% of the cases and outbreaks were associated with the water distribution system in the facility. Lots of people say to me, Legionella is everywhere. That is a myth. If you look at studies about where we find Legionella, depending on the study, buildings and hospitals are colonized anywhere from 12% to 70%. The rule of thumb is 50%. So are you in the 50% that's colonized, or are you in the 50% that's not? So revisiting, now that I've said all of that, how we're doing, I'm going to give us a bad report card. But again, I'm a glass half full person, so we're going to do better. What I say is Legionella is the problem you don't think you have until you have it. And I've seen this many times. And why does this occur? Because people are like the ostrich here. They have their head in the sand, and they wait until after cases occur to deal with the issue. That's too late. The mortality rate for hospital-acquired Legionnaire's disease is 25 to 30%. So if you have a case of healthcare-acquired Legionnaire's disease, it's highly likely that that patient's going to die. We can do better. So these are my favorite sort of top 10 reasons for denial. Legionella is not in my water. I've never seen Legionnaire's disease, so it's not going to happen to me or my facility. You know, that water management stuff I hear about, it's a waste of money. And I'm not going to test for Legionella and find out what the risk is because I don't have to. Well, sometimes Legionella is like a hot potato. Sometimes people that are diagnosing Legionnaire's disease and that patient has been in and out of your facility want to conclude that it's not theirs. And so the question is, whose case is it? So I'm going to tell you a couple things about definitions, not to bore you, but it's important so that you know whether it's your case or not. So the people that make these definitions are, of course, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And the acronym CSTE stands for Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists. So what are the definitions that you really need to be aware of? A presumptive definition of healthcare-associated Legionnaire's disease means that that patient was in your facility for a continuous stay at the facility during the 14 days prior to onset. So they weren't anywhere else, in other words. So that means it's really your case. Then there's this category, which is that gray place, possible healthcare associated. They were there for some portion of the 14 days. So maybe they came in from a nursing home, was in your facility for a couple of days and went back to the nursing home and has a diagnosis of Legionnaire's disease. That's defined as possible. And the tendency is to say, you know, it's not mine. They got it at the nursing home. But how do you really know? And one of the problems with this thinking is that the average stay today for a case of pneumonia is short, about 5 days. So very few cases will fulfill that definition of presumptive healthcare associated Legionnaire's disease. So here's the warning for you. Don't assume a possible case is not healthcare acquired. Investigate, ask yourself, could they have gotten it here? Because if you get the answer and the answer is no, great. But if the answer is yes, you want to prevent any future cases. So if you don't investigate, you miss that opportunity. So please investigate. And then knock, 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 it's the health department at the door. That's not a good day for anybody. So what triggers a public health investigation? One of those cases that's definite healthcare acquired might trigger that investigation. Certainly 2 that fall into this category of possible, probable. And it's now within a 1-year period. Used to be 6 months. So it's highly likely that that net's going to catch you. And then, of course, patients that are in transplant units like bone marrow. So that triggers the investigation. Lots of times people have regret. I should have been proactive because it's very painful when that investigation occurs. What do I mean by that? It's painful and expensive. So even though you could have been proactive and had control over the number of samples that you had to test, when it's an investigation, that explodes sometimes into the hundreds because they want you to test not only the immediate environment of the patient, but many, many areas throughout the facility. Now you're on bottled water restrictions, no showering. There's a clinical look back for other cases. You have to do emergency disinfection. And what happens in an emergency to the prices of goods and services? Doesn't go down. So then you have to evaluate whether it was successful. Then you have to sample for Legionella every 2 weeks for 3 months, then monthly for 3 more months. If any Legionella of any kind is detected during that series of tests, you have to begin the sequence all over again. Whatever people were doing, whether it's the chief financial officer, the chief nurse, the chief medical officer, the CEO, the COO, all of them have to drop what they're doing. And then you have to have long-term disinfection measures usually instituted. So you can see how complicated that can be. So Legionella in the water system is a patient risk, and even a single case dramatically affects the bottom line. I give you one example here at Grady Hospital in Atlanta. In the first week of their outbreak, they spent $700,000 in the first week. So you know they went over $1 million. So it's a problem, but what's the solution? So this is the headline in June from CDC. Vital signs use water management programs in buildings to help prevent outbreaks. Yes. So what is that? What is water safety and management? So 2015, ASHRAE comes out, Legionellosis Risk Management in Building Water Systems. Shortly thereafter, the CDC does a toolkit, which is sort of like water management for dummies kind of thing. So now the emphasis is water management. Well, the ASHRAE standard really only sets a minimum criteria for assessing risk. So that's a really important thing to understand. The survey of the building is designed to identify known risk factors in terms of the building systems, design, occupants. That survey needs to be done annually. And, it includes things, do you have a cooling tower, spas, pools? Healthcare should not have decorative water features inside, and according to the FGI guidelines. Aerosol devices, cooling towers, it's tall. Is it a healthcare facility? That immediately places you as necessary for risk assessment and water management, long-term care, and CMS compliance. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. At a very high level, these are the elements of that plan. The program team is very important. You have to have flow diagrams showing what the system looks like. You have to decide where the control points are and what the control measures are going to be. Have corrective actions should you be outside of those control limits. Confirm that the plan is being implemented as designed, and then validate that Legionella is under control. And then, of course, everything about document. Well, I just want to say one thing about the team. You are on the team, but please, please, please include infection control. They have a unique perspective, and it's really important for them to be on the team as well as these other members of the team. You're probably aware that in 2017, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services shocked the Legionella world and came out with this memorandum requirement to reduce Legionella risk in healthcare facility water systems to prevent cases and outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease. I was like, wow, that's fantastic. And of course, CMS refers to ASHRAE and CDC. So 2017 memo says implement the plan to reduce Legionella and, interestingly, other waterborne opportunistic pathogens. And I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. All covered facilities have to have water management policies to reduce Legionella and these pathogens, and conduct a risk assessment to identify areas where Legionella and these pathogens could grow and spread. Well, who are these other pathogens? Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, Burkholderia. Now you're learning microbiology. Stenotrophomonas multifida. I always like to say that. It sort of sounds like you should be doing a line dance. Stenotrophomonas multifida, kick. Non-tuberculous mycobacteria and fungi. Well, why does CMS care about those other pathogens? Well, it's because they also cause healthcare-acquired infections. They disproportionately affect the immunocompromised, and they are more likely to be antibiotic resistant. So I call them X-bugs. I don't know if you're a fan of X-Men, but that's what these organisms are. They're very, very dangerous because they're difficult to treat. They're also not usually part of the human flora. They're usually found in water, obviously, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa is in soil, fruits, and vegetables. So be careful about that salad if you're immunocompromised. And exposure and disease is very, very preventable. So these organisms are in your pipes and they help each other. They live synergistically. They have a little bit of nutrient. They grow together. They help each other. It's at the right temperature. So what I say is they are having a party in your pipes. Yes, think about it that way. And we have to be the crashers of that party. So again, in that 2017 memo, in addition to having the risk assessment and water management, they also said, and I bolded it here, environmental testing for pathogens. I fell out of my chair. Finally, yes, that's the champagne. A national requirement for Legionella testing. Yay! I sent an email to David Wright and said, you've done more for the prevention of Legionnaire's disease than CDC and everybody combined. Well, my party lasted 1 year because they revised their memorandum. And why did they revise their memorandum? They wanted to tell us they don't require cultures for Legionella and other pathogens. Ugh. Back to it's at your discretion. Okay, well, what happened? I know CMS was lobbied to remove this provision. So much for that. On we go. I want you to understand also that the ASHRAE standard is not foolproof. And so that's why I say mind the gaps. What do I mean? The standard tells you what to do, but not how to do it. So if any of you have read it, you know it's a very thin document. Well, what does this mean when I say it creates gaps? Illness can still occur. There can be vulnerabilities and liabilities for failing to prevent the disease. So that minimum criteria is not enough, in my opinion, to be proactive prevention. Well, enter in 2020, a revised ASHRAE Guideline 12, managing the risk of legionellosis associated with building water systems. This guidance document is much thicker and really answers a lot of questions about how to go about implementing water management. But successfully implementing water management, you know, there's a 50-50 chance that something can go wrong, and 9 out of 10 times it will. That's a Paul Harvey quote. Well, we need better Legionella water management. So here's the problem. More and more people are providing these services for water management. So how can you know that the provider is knowledgeable? Really important question. It's kind of like ICRA for carpenters. So ASHRAE says the program team shall have knowledge of the building water system design and water management. And here's the key, as it relates to legionellosis. Well, check off the box, you know everything about how these systems work, but who knows how it relates to legionellosis? Who has that knowledge? Well, now in 2020, we have a professional qualification standard. It's an ASSE ANSI approved standard 1280 for Legionella water safety and management specialists. This sets minimum criteria for people doing Legionella water management, development, administration, and execution of risk assessments and water safety management programs for Legionella and building water systems. Finally, some criteria for knowledge. And it's extensive. So this is the list included in the training: Legionella, Legionnaire's disease, environmental testing, waterborne pathogens, construction and renovation, what to do in a case investigation. So it's very extensive. And then the people being certified have to have that minimum 24-hour course and pass a written proctored exam of a minimum of 100 questions. So this is rigorous. And you have to get a score of at least 80% in order to be certified. So really important. I recommend this, and I participate as an instructor. The next training is August 23rd and then October 18th. So consider enrolling in that. Well, what do I mean by breaking news? Well, it's the Joint Commission. And back in the fall, they proposed changes related to water management, and there was a public review period. Well, then in March, they announced these new requirements. And, you know, it's like E.F. Hutton, what Joint Commission says, we all listen. So they are proposing stronger requirements in their environment of care relating to water management. So those are the numbers up there that you need to be concerned about. And it's based again on CMS, CDC, and ASHRAE. So they want to make sure that the risk to patients is minimized. So annual waterborne risk assessment, water management team, this is all in ASHRAE, right? Describe how the system is used. They want to give you time to implement it. So they're giving you a heads up now that this is coming. So it's going to appear in the manuals in July now, but you won't be held to that exactly until January of 2022. So you have some time, but they're going to be asking you about it. Are you prepared? If you're interested, we actually had a Joint Commission person give a webinar for us. So if you go to specialpathogenslab.com in the resources section, it's our Puzzled by Legionella webinar series. You can listen to a Joint Commission representative talk about these changes. Well, with regard to detecting Legionella in building water systems, I love this quote from Dr. Bruce Dixon. If you don't look for it, you won't find it. If you don't find it, you don't think you have a problem. If you don't think you have a problem, you don't do anything about it. This is why detecting Legionella is important. In the old days, The environmental look for Legionella, testing for Legionella, was only done after the case occurred. We have always said, be proactive. Before those cases occur, do the environmental testing, identify the source. That allows you to control the source and prevent disease entirely. Proactive versus reactive. Environmental testing for Legionella is not onerous. A minimum of 10 outlets, faucets and showers, roughly representing the water distribution system. First, draw hot water tanks, the recirc line. That will answer the question, is Legionella in my building? Then we want to know, are patients at risk? And the best way to do that is know what proportion of those outlets are positive. If it's greater than 30% and serogroup 1 Legionella pneumophila is present, we know from studies historically that that presents risk. And that actually is now included in the New York State regulation for prevention of Legionella in healthcare. What does CDC say about environmental testing for Legionella? Environmental testing for Legionella is useful to validate the effectiveness of control measures. Sure, factors that might make testing more important: difficulty maintaining building water systems within control limits, any prior history, and then here's the kicker, being a healthcare facility. So CDC is telling you should be testing. Well, I love QR codes. So if you have your phone and you open your camera and you hold it up to this QR code, it's going to take you to the January toolkit update for controlling Legionella and common sources. What is significant about this January change is that not that they talk about the things that we normally talk about, water, age, temperature, that kind of thing. But what is significant is that they have included now routine testing for Legionella. It is the first time in my long history I have seen CDC actually give guidance on routine testing, not case investigation. So you go to, if you took that QR code and you go to that page, module 6, pages F1 to F5, and it tells you about routine testing for Legionella. So if anybody tells you CDC says don't test, that has now changed as of January. The other thing that's useful in this update is there's confusion about what's the volume of water I should collect. People will tell you, you have to collect a liter. Well, CDC has clarified this. 250 ml volume is okay for routine testing. Thank you, CDC, for clarifying that. Who does the testing? It should be an accredited laboratory using standardized methodologies. That laboratory should be capable of retaining Legionella isolates and performing additional characterization if necessary, especially if it's a case investigation. They go further in talking about interpretation of routine monitoring based on concentration, that percent positivity, what type of Legionella is found. And they say the presence of any Legionella should trigger response activities. That's really important. And this is very different. I can't emphasize that enough. So I put this table here not so that you can read it. You can go to that document and look at it. But here's the table that talks about concentration, extent of colonization, and what type, examples of controlled, well-controlled, poorly controlled in that CDC guidance on routine Legionella monitoring. Is the sky falling if I find some Legionella? Absolutely not. This is where we talk about the goal is 0 cases, not 0 Legionella in my building, water system, or cooling tower. And why? Because it's virtually impossible to get to 0. I have been doing this a long time. It's impossible to get to 0, but we can control it enough to prevent disease. So controlling Legionella prevents disease. It's not about reaching 0 Legionella. In terms of what methods should be used to detect Legionella, standard culture remains the most reliable. You can get a final result in our laboratory. Generally, it's 7 days. There are other methods, and many of them people are saying you can do them yourself. But there are some pitfalls here, things that you should know about. So for example, this enzyme-based assay has resulted in false positive results with organisms that are often found in our water systems like Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So be careful about interpreting positive results. And in fact, a prison outbreak using this methodology had lots of positives that were not able to be confirmed by CDC. So false positivity is a problem, and also false negatives. So this is this sort of pregnancy dip type slide. It's the same technology that we use for the urine antigen. So you might expect it to be good, but in our hands, when we put water with 3,000 Legionella per ml, it was completely negative. So be careful about what test is being performed and who's doing it. So the guy on the right is a professional microbiologist. The guy on the left is the do-it-yourselfer. So when you put a spec out for Legionella testing, make sure it's in an accredited laboratory. So now I have Legionella in my building. Now what? When to consider disinfection? Now there is some help with this question in ASHRAE Guideline 12/2020. What do they say? Consider supplemental disinfection if you can't maintain temperatures reliably throughout the system, if you can't maintain disinfectant. So I can tell you that almost all of your systems can't maintain chlorine in hot water. So should you use supplemental disinfection? Well, find out if Legionella is there first, because you might be in the 50% that don't have it. Well, if you need to do supplemental disinfection, there's short-term elevated temperature, elevated chlorination, long-term continuous chlorination, copper silver ionization, chlorine dioxide, monochloramine, point of use filtration. I could give a whole lecture on disinfection technologies because we've evaluated and published on all of them. So how do you choose, right? And hopefully you're not choosing in an emergency. So do some research. Don't assume the salesperson's telling you everything you need to know. Consult with experts, get information from other users. And lastly, don't Google it. You're not going to get accurate information. I'm a big fan of Guardians of the Galaxy. I think we can defeat Legionella and waterborne pathogens together. I hope you're a fan. So now you've got an A on your report card. Isn't that great? You feel good about that? Well, I know that all this talk about case investigations and outbreaks and Legionella and Stenotrophomonas multifida causes anxiety. So we don't leave you in the lurch about that. We actually have Dr. Stout's Legionella chill pills for Legionella-related anxiety. If you want them, they're mints, of course, but I can send you a whole bunch of them. And what's fun about them is if you have trouble having conversations about Legionella, you can get the Legionella chill pills out and then everybody has a laugh and then you start talking about the serious aspects of it. So in conclusion, no surprise, I'm going to tell you to be proactive. Whatever other people have told you about Legionella is there or not, CDC says don't test, be proactive. First step, risk assessment. Second step, water management. And the water management plan should not be a 2-page document. Page 1 is look at these other policies in our facility. Page 2 is references. That won't fly when the public health people come. And I'm not making that up. That actually happened. And then perform routine Legionella testing per the new CDC guidance. Find out, are you in the 50% that has Legionella? Or are you in the 50% that don't? Do you need to worry about your patients or don't you need to worry about your patients? So my favorite part of this webinar is say thank you to you for attending and thanks again to Chicago Faucets for bringing us together. But here's your opportunity to ask the expert. And this is beneficial to all of the people that are attending either now or will be attending later via the recording to hear the questions that you have. So I'd like to invite you now to ask me, Stump the Expert. Thank you so much.
Oh, we got one, you got one.
All right. Hi, thanks, Janet. We actually do have a few questions in the Q&A. The first one that just popped in was, could you please speak a bit on chlorine versus chloramines?
Yes, so great question. So in the early days, the only two tools in the toolbox for Legionella remediation were elevated temperature, superheat and flush, which we developed at the Pittsburgh VA, or adding a ton of chlorine to the system. What we learned is neither one of those were great. They knock Legionella down, but Legionella will persist. And over the years, with regard to chlorine, we've learned that at least 2 ppm of free chlorine throughout the system is really what is necessary to consistently control Legionella. So you might hear people say 0.5 part per million. Generally, that's just not enough to get good control. So you need more chlorine. What we also learned from those early hospitals using chlorine is that they had so much corrosion because it's such a strong oxidant, right? It just, like I remember the Wadsworth VA in Los Angeles spending millions of dollars replacing their pipes because they had used chlorine for years. So marginal efficacy, high damage to your system with chlorine. Well, the difference with monochloramine is it's a weaker oxidant. And you would think weaker means not as effective. But because we know Legionella is in the biofilm embedded in that scale and corrosion products within our pipes, when chlorine hits it, it reacts to that material and the disinfecting ability is gone. Because monochloramine is a weaker oxidant, it can actually penetrate further into the biofilm, and it has turned out to be extremely effective. And the first clues about that actually came from the CDC, where they noticed that hospitals that were in communities where the municipal water was treated with monochloramine had fewer cases of Legionnaire's disease than the municipalities that were using chlorine, which is the more common disinfectant for our city water supplies. And then, people, innovation is important. People hearing that said, let's design a disinfecting system that can add monochloramine to our water distribution systems. And we were the first to test that in the United States here in Pittsburgh. Out in Italy and Europe, they had been demonstrating efficacy of this application for a number of years. So extremely effective, less damaging. Monochloramine is less damaging to your pipes because of it's a weaker oxidant. And so that's my 2 cents on chlorine versus monochloramine. Thank you for the question.
2 more.
All right, that's great. A couple more questions just popped in. Next one is hot water recirculation looping in commercial buildings are generally kept between 115 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. What is to keep Legionella from populating these lines that feed the showers in the building?
Great question. A couple of things come to my mind. So you're talking about a commercial office building, but the concept really applies to any large building that has a recirculating loop. And when you look at the ASHRAE Standard 188 criteria for, what building needs to have water management and risk assessment, having a larger building with recirculating hot water is a risk. And so again, kind of going back to that 50% of the buildings have Legionella and 50% don't. And that's true even if their hot water is operating at those temperatures. We don't know why really yet, why some buildings may be operating at the same temperature and one has Legionella and one doesn't. And in fact, in 2019, we published a paper where we looked at high rises in New York City, took 270 samples from 28 different buildings. And again, it was 53% of those buildings had Legionella in them. And one of the hypotheses we tested during that study was, well, what if the water in the recirculating line was hotter? Would that prevent Legionella from being detected in the fixtures downstream in the networks? And the answer was no. You can have higher temperature. And in fact, ASHRAE says 124, I think, is the target for the recirc temperature. You can have that higher temperature, but the temperature goes down as the water goes away from that centralized recirculating line. So you can lose 5 to 10 degrees in distribution. So what you really got to think in your building, you should think about the hot water lines, the recirc line as a different environment than what's happening out there at the fixtures. And it's at the fixtures, at that point of exposure, that we're most concerned and want to apply controls to prevent exposure of the people using those fixtures. So temperature matters, but unless you can get 130 degrees out that fixture, you can't really use temperature as your control measure.
All right, you must be inspiring people because questions are popping in still. Is there a concern for water left in a gooseneck spout?
I'm not overly concerned about that. We did learn in our early studies, for example, pedal sinks, where you've got that column of water above the pedals down at the floor that sits there. And in some respects, a gooseneck is like that. But the design, I think, today of those fixtures has learned from the past, and they try not to hold a lot of water there. Some designs might, so the type of fixture that you purchase, you want to have a discussion about that. But it's not like when we do surveys, only the goosenecks are positive and the regular fixtures are not. And so you need to look out for those columns of water, try to minimize them as much as you can, but it's not a dominant deciding factor.
All right, great. Outside of Legionella, Pseudomonas serogroup 1, what are the most dangerous strains?
So that's sort of a combination of two concepts here. So we'll just talk about Legionella first. So we talk a lot about Legionella pneumophilus serogroup 1. It's called serogroup 1 because it was the first identified at that American Legion outbreak in 1976. So it was the first. Now there are 16 at least reported serogroups of Legionella. So when I'm talking to people about microbiology, I say, imagine in your mind a family tree. And so at the top of the tree is Legionella, and all the little spikes below it are all the members of the Legionella family. Legionella pneumophila is one of them. And then below that are 16 now branches of the different serogroups. So the order in terms of disease that's reported to the CDC, serogroup 1 is the majority. And we did a multi-center, actually a multi-country study and demonstrated that. But serogroups 6 and 4 are second and third there. So it doesn't mean that the other serogroups of Legionella can't cause disease. And so you really want to make sure that you know what type of serogroup you are. And here's another reason why doing environmental monitoring helps clinicians in their choices of diagnostic test. So if you do a survey, environmental testing, and you find serogroup 6 in your water, well, there's risk there. But the most important thing is you tell the physician that the urine antigen test is not going to work in diagnosing cases of serogroup 6 infection because the urine antigen test is specific only for serogroup 1. And I can't tell you how many times like the light bulb went off over the head of the clinical people going, oh, I never thought about that. So other serogroups of Legionella, other than serogroup 1, cause infection. Other species, other members of the family, like Legionella mcdadii, named after Joseph McDade at the CDC, often causes infections in the immunocompromised. So you have to worry about those other species in your high-risk units. That's why CDC said any Legionella isolated, regardless of species, is important and actionable. So the other organisms, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, among those other waterborne pathogens, probably causes the most infection in your ICU and elsewhere in the hospital. And so we want to, and I'll get on my soapbox just for a second, no babies get Legionella. So in your NICU, you want to control Pseudomonas and other pathogens in the fixtures of your NICU. There's no excuse for not addressing and saving babies, okay? So make sure if you do anything after this lecture is that you test your NICU for Legionella and these other waterborne pathogens And if you find them, you put measures in place to prevent exposure. And bathing neonates in water contaminated with these organisms does cause infection.
All right, thank you. Lots of good questions coming in. We'll go for a few more minutes. Have you seen an increased number of Legionella cases since the start of the pandemic, especially since buildings were shut down and some fixtures such as drinking fountains have been shut off since the pandemic?
You know, that is a great question, and one that I asked myself. It's like, what's happening with the reported cases of Legionnaire's disease? So a couple of comments here. I'm always very optimistic. And so the good news is that there's been a lot of talk and a lot of communication, even reports in the New York Times and IAPMO and CDC and AWWA. All of these organizations kind of put out the warning, be careful about the fact that water, either no use or low use conditions, can amplify bacteria, including Legionella, in our water systems. Don't occupy those buildings without doing something to address that risk. So we know that we're on the tipping point or the precipice of problems as people open up and people go to hotels and office buildings and close down healthcare units. So the risk is real. Has that manifested in large number of cases? So one of the things that I thought was interesting is that during 2020, the reported cases of Legionnaire's disease nationwide went down. Remember, I showed you that graph going up, 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 year after year after year. Well, with COVID, it kind of like a rock went down. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Not that Legionella disappeared, but people were focused, clinicians focused on diagnosing COVID cases. And there are a couple of reports in the literature where there was a misdiagnosis. They were looking for COVID. They didn't think to look for Legionella, and the person actually had Legionnaire's disease. So probably cases were going on, but they were missed. And underdiagnosis and misdiagnosis was a problem before COVID, just got exacerbated by COVID. And so I anticipate that curve going back up. I hope that we've learned enough that we take proactive measures to prevent exposure to that water that has been in the pipes. The party in the pipes has been going on all year. Let's be the party crashers and make sure that we don't let that happen to people that occupy our buildings.
All right, thank you. I was kind of curious about that one myself. Couple more questions that we have. I think we have time for a couple more. In your opinion, do you feel commercial buildings, regardless of the type of use, is it safer to help prevent Legionella in public and private space faucets using a whole building ASSE 1070 type system or individual point of use ASSE 1070 valves?
I'm not an expert on 1070 valves, so I can't address that part specifically. And if the person can add more to the chat or the Q&A to help clarify that while I'm speaking, that'd be great. So in general, the approach to any building that would fulfill those risk criteria as stipulated by ASHRAE Standard 188 means that these criteria these criteria in 188 have been associated with disease in buildings. It doesn't mean that there's going to be disease. It just means that they've been associated in the past and they might represent risk within the building, whether it's a commercial building or a healthcare building. The approach that we take is similar in healthcare versus non-healthcare. First question you're asking, is Legionella present or not? If the answer is not, and I mentioned that study where in New York City in the commercial buildings, we only found Legionella in about 50% of those 28 buildings. So it wasn't everywhere. So you're sort of doing this algorithm. Legionella present, yes, no. Who's in the building? Is it high risk? Is it an apartment complex that's for seniors? Well, that's high risk, right? So now we want to be more aggressive in our response. So the CDC over the years has said many times the presence of Legionella all by itself does not predict disease. But we know that there are certain criteria: extensive colonization, more than 30% of the outlets being positive, the presence of Legionella pneumophilus serogroup 1, and other things mean that the risk is greater. And so you can use, first step is using engineering controls to try to mitigate its presence. So you can try, depending on the risk tolerance of the building, elevating temperature, and also being compliant with building codes. You can do some periodic disinfection. You don't necessarily have to jump to installing a permanent system. You can do some plumbing modifications, removing dead legs if you want on an ongoing basis as you're doing construction, things that can reduce conditions that are conducive to Legionella growth. So it's a stepwise process, being mindful that you can't take the next step till you have the answer to the first step.
All right, thank you, Janet. And one more question. There's a lot of questions in here. Maybe we can type them in after the fact. But with antimicrobial outlets and finishes, do they help control biofilm and Legionella?
I just want to say, way to go, all of you, for answering these or asking these great questions and participating at such a high level. It really makes it a wonderful opportunity for everybody to learn from your questions. So the answer to that question, actually, I mentioned the Swanson School of Engineering, and my research colleagues there are currently evaluating silver impregnated into the plastics of shower heads as an antimicrobial. So stay tuned for the answer on that study. And certainly the concept, I think, is sort of like, we know copper is inhibitory to bacteria. So if I have copper pipes, does that mean I'm not going to have bacteria in my pipes or Legionella in my pipes? And what we've learned is that brand new copper, not much Legionella, it's inhibitory, but as that copper ages, it's going to get scaled up. There's going to be layers of material, whether it's biofilm or corrosion byproducts. And so now that inhibitory activity, or the antimicrobial activity of copper, is mitigated, it's gone. And I think probably that's true with other substances as well, but every little bit helps.
All right. Thank you very much. I just want to wrap up. Again, a very big thank you to Dr. Janet Stout. As a reminder, a recording from today's webinar will be available soon, so keep an eye out on your email for that. This is part one of a three-part series with Dr. Janet Stout, so stay tuned. The second one coming up is August 22nd. So more information coming from the Chicago Faucet Company and the Special Pathogens Lab. Please also, if you're going to attend the ASHI show in Nashville on the 8th and 9th, please feel free to drop by and say hello. We'd love to meet you. Thank you again for attending today's Lunch and Learn, and have a great day. Thank you very much.